is that you guys are pointing at, I think, something very similar. You're stumbling on it in two different ways. You're coming at it from two different angles. Wade, cultural anthropologist, storyteller, and you wrote this article you've shared with me, and feel free to expand on. You just feel like something had to be said.
Yeah, I mean, I
just
was going to say that you introduced me to Daniel when we first connected, and I just loved listening to him. And when I was just listening to your conversation, it struck me that of just how important it is to know history. I was just reading earlier today one of the classic books about Vietnam by Stanley Karnoff, and you just see how those men, Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk and Johnson and all their kind of various advisors, the scores of them, were just stumbling around in that void, doing what they tried to do, and it's almost agonizing to be reading the contemporary accounts of their decision making in 1963 to 4 to 5, knowing what was going to be the result, and the kind of analysis that Daniel just did, taking us through the patterns of history. If he quoted Churchill, and another one of, I think, Churchill's saying, I think it was Churchill who said that if you don't study history, you'll never you're condemned to repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. And in my little analysis of the COVID thing, what made it, I suppose, unique, and certainly what caused it to hit a nerve, is just the point of view, the kind of the anthropological lens that I was thinking of this less as a story of medicine than of culture. But Daniel takes us to a whole nother level of depth, right? And it raises the issue of how astonishingly important a knowledge of history is for anyone who has the audacity to think that they can lead us or lead anyone, right? And when it's not trivial, that George Patton knew classical warfare of the Greeks in the Mediterranean zone. It's not an accident that Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature and wrote more books than most contemporary politicians have read. And when you think of the most horrifying many horrifying aspects of the current administration in Washington, the word ignorant is really means without knowledge, lack of gnosis, right? And when you have a president who literally doesn't know when World War II began, who doesn't know the most fundamental aspects of history, who has never read anything, who famously doesn't read. And then when you contrast that to what we just heard from Daniel, unraveling the threads of history, the mystic connections of history that have brought us to where we are. My overwhelming impression listening to him is just how important, how vital a knowledge of history is in the moment, and certainly for those who have the gumption and the audacity to believe that they have the right to lead the rest of us.
And interesting, as you're saying that, I was thinking about what you were speaking of is this Asian century, will it be Chinese led? And Xi Jinping is a very serious scholar of history, political theory, philosophy, military history. My understanding is actually a very serious translator and scholar of all of the kind of classic Chinese works. And that when he came to power, the people who were in high positions of the CCP all had to have a pretty high degree of background and training in the 36 stratagems and the art of war and the warring states region. And you can imagine if the US Senate and Congress all had to have the whole kind of history of Western philosophy and the canon the Napoleonic Wars and Alexander the Great and et cetera. It'd be a different story, and kind of the founding fathers did, right? And this is one of the institutional things, is that when you're trying to emerge, you have to work really hard, but there's a way of kind of getting fat when you are the dominant empire and you have forgotten the problems, and the very hard work of staying actively educated and engaged doesn't seem immediately eminently necessary. And that's one of the things that leads to the decay.
I think that's so true. I mean, the famous quip by Kennedy when he welcomed all the Nobel laureates to the White House, and he said there wasn't as much intellectual firepower in that room since the last time Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And I think that's so true. I mean, there's an understandable but a kind of a disturbing American almost embrace of ignorance. There's a if you know too much, you're sort of you're not really a man or something. Certainly we're until 9/11, the vast majority of congressmen didn't even own passports. And one of the things that I've noticed, I used to lecture on private jet trips for the National Geographic that would go around the world, and they were very, very expensive trips for people. And generally, the individuals who came along were really wonderful people, very, very affluent by definition. And they had all had incredibly successful careers, but their careers had focused on making the most hospital beds or something, or running this corporation and being a real expert on packaged meats or something like that. But outside of that expertise, outside of golf, football, and sports, there just wasn't. It wasn't as if a general education was deemed to be that essential to corporate affairs. I mean, I used to go through this with my own father-in-law, who was very well read compared to normal politicians, but he was a most beloved man, the most wonderful man, the greatest, the embodiment of everything that a great American is, in my opinion. But he was Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, almost president. He was offered the vice presidency by Richard Nixon, and he turned it down. He supported Rockefeller, when he came to visit us at our fish camp in northern British Columbia, guidebook in hand, he came over to me and said, "Wade, did you know Canada was the second biggest country on earth?" And then he was very desperate to have a newspaper, and the nearest newspaper we could get for him was a 4-day-old copy of the Toronto Globe and Mail, which a bush pilot brought in. And Granddaddy's sitting there by the fire, very, very content with the newspaper at last. But then he quizzically looks at me, pulls down the newspaper, and looks up from his bifocals and said, "Wade, why is there so much news on Canada in this newspaper?" And those are kind of not gentle cliches, and obviously Granddaddy at that point was past his prime. So I'm not being in any way, but there is this this sense that to know too much is to be almost suspect in the United States. And I don't think that was certainly true in the Kennedy era. Maybe they thought they knew too much in the case of someone like McNamara, but certainly, knowledge of the world has never been a credential for political office in the United States.
I'll share a couple thoughts on partly how I think we got here, and it's by no means a comprehensive addressing, because I think there's actually quite a few threads that are involved. What makes someone particularly good in the market and what makes them comprehensively educated about history don't necessarily overlap all that well. And doing very well in the market means that you can influence DC to have people do your bidding, and the people who are susceptible to do that will do better and whatever. So there's a whole bunch of other reasons, but a couple reasons that maybe are slightly less often thought about and valuable. One is, I think the focus in the types of knowledge that mattered coming out of World War II made a very drastic shift to STEM focus because of the critical role that technology played in the war. And we can see that it was like we built the entire Manhattan Project around Oppenheimer and like a few people who had really asymmetric technological and physical insights. And Bletchley Park around, and a couple major things around Turing and von Neumann, and that pretty much determined the war, right? Like the bomb and the computer, and then
synthetic rubber.
Yeah,
Synthetic rubber was the third example.
And Sputnik getting there first, I think there was this very real sense of, and one way to look at World War II was the competition between the US and the Russians for the German scientists. And not just, so Operation Paperclip here and the Russian version of it. There's the famous joke that who would win the Cold War between the USSR and USA was who got the better Nazi scientists. But like it played a significant role. But I think there became a very heavy focus in let's focus on STEM. But George Washington said it should be the primary aim of this government to train every single citizen in the science of government. And the science of government meant history, politics, game theory, courtier dynamics, etc. Because if they didn't understand it, those who did would run everything, and it would become a kleptocracy and then an oligarchy or some weird thing, not a democracy. So I think the civics training became very de-emphasized. That's one part. The other part I think is very important is, and this is, so I'm gonna say something that I think is more sympathetic with the anti-intellectual movement, is I think the anti-intellectual movement was a game theoretic counter strategy to intellectualism used as a political weapon. And things can be true that are not representative of the whole truth, right? Like one of the things I see all the time is people say, well, obviously herbs and supplements and peptides don't really work that well because there aren't that many phase 3 clinical trials showing that they work, and there are for pharmameds. Well, there's no fucking money because there's no patentability on any of those things. Of course, they'll never get phase 3 trials. And the phase 3 trials that showed that Premarin worked or Vioxx worked didn't mean that they didn't kill massive numbers of people, because what's included in the scope of the safety analysis. And so it's true, those phase 3 clinical trials are true. And if you are literate, you understand that they're true, but they're not representative, right? Because if here's the whole space of possible health interventions, the ones that are profitable will get the most research, and they represent this space. So then the preponderance of data is an uneven distribution, right? So similarly, I can put an IPCC together and say all of this stuff on climate change, but it doesn't, DC's still running the benign China hypothesis and not looking at that particular issue seriously. Bannon was actually a big part of, and Trump delivering the US from the benign China hypothesis. So there was a way that I see that throughout history, whenever something becomes a source of legitimate authority, whether it's the church or academia, then there's so much power in being the one who says what is true, that then anyone who's very good at the game of power has a maximum incentive to try to capture and influence that legitimate authority. So the legitimate authority starts getting influenced by who's funding it and how the prestige networks work and those types of things. So then legitimate authority in the US started to have a particular set of political biases that a lot of people in the US didn't feel represented their interests well. And so, but they couldn't argue against the IPCC thing well, but they could feel like it was not aligned with their interests. So anti-intellectualism, since they couldn't compete at it, was actually their counterweapon. I just won't engage with the weapons that you're using that feel like they're against me. And so one of the ways I think to actually have sense-making really be able to be pervasive is that it is not weaponized for partial political or economic agendas, that it is authentically seeking to understand the entire space and be in the benefit of everyone, as opposed to that as a virtue signal. Otherwise, I think the anti-intellectualism becomes a natural counterweapon.
Let me ask you about China, because one of the things that was interesting in the criticism of my article, I was a number of people, Jeffrey Sachs for one, a friend of mine who founded Code Pink, quite liberal individual, were very critical of my last paragraph when I essentially said we'll miss the American era if China is in control. And I cited in that the treatment of the Uyghurs, the social contracts, the social capital thing, and just the treatment of democracy, et cetera. And there's a sort of thing on the left that we're now bashing China. And is that the left being reflexively counter to whatever Trump is doing, because Trump's bashing China, therefore we shouldn't bash China? And then you parse it down and you see that Jeffrey Sachs is up to his eyeballs in contracts with the Chinese government. And I know that in my travels around the world, I've seen the footprint of China virtually everywhere. I mean, just if you can build your way to dominance, that's what they're doing. I mean, the police station in Rarotonga, the opera house in Dakar, an interchange in Togo, in Lomé, the capital of Togo. I mean, obviously the Belt Initiative, but also great roads across the Amazon. And I'm and I've also, of course, seen firsthand what has happened to Tibet. And there seems to be this thing: as long as China does development work, it's, in other words, builds stuff, that somehow it's okay, and that they're not, And that gets back to this whole thing where genocide is universally condemned, but ethnocide, the destruction of people's life, is not only not condemned, it's considered proper development policy in many quarters. So what is your sense of China in the next century?
Yeah, it's such a critical question. I don't claim to know what's in Xi Jinping's mind or what the internal plans and sense-making of the CCP are. And nor do I represent that whatever those are represents the actual will of all the Chinese people outside of Beijing, which it obviously doesn't.
Let me just sort of interrupt, Daniel, but you're so right in that. I mean, there is a terrible tendency in the West to see China as this monolith, when in fact, of course, it's remarkably diverse, ethnically, vast country, vast numbers of people, vast orientations, and so on. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm not going to say that there aren't some people who have a xenophobic, racist relationship just because it seems big and scary and they don't like the big scary thing, so they make it the Chinese monolith. Of course, there is some reactive, non-thinking part of that. I wouldn't say that that is much dumber than the benign China hypothesis was. I would say those are kind of equally not clear assessments. I think The 100-Year Marathon is a particularly interesting book around China's long-term plan starting in, give or take, 1949, and that is kind of tracking quite well. I think we've had a period where nobody remembers in their own lived experience very serious war in the developed world. And so they don't really have any embodied sense that that's even a thing. So their actual sense of history is quite bad, right? Like their embodied sense is quite bad. And so they don't recognize that like slavery and genocide and initiating war and empire has been kind of the story for the whole history of civilization. Everybody, like, it's not just been European white slavery. It was the Ottomans and Turks enslaving Europeans. It was people in Asia in slavery, inter-Asian slavery. It was, Comanche violence with other First Tribes people. Like, largely humans have just been kind of violent fucks for a long time, often. And that's an important part of the story. So when we say the US was built on genocide and slavery, and how can it have any kind of moral value, that's a very real story. And like, what do we do for reparations on genocide and slavery? And the whole world was in a context of slavery and genocide. Arguably, you could say British colonialism was less violent than Dutch or Spanish or some of the other colonialisms. You go to the Congo and whatever in some ways. So this is why the historical context is important. And so then I'm going to think of China in light of that. If I put myself in my imagining of Xi's position, I'm actually quite empathetic to everything he's doing. And in some ways, I can say it's the smartest thing anyone in the world is doing, because there are some critical problems that it appears he's paying attention to that no one else is even paying earnest attention to. So I'm very empathetic to the solutions he has. That doesn't mean I like the solutions or want them to happen. So just to kind of briefly frame that, rule of law requires a monopoly of violence. If you don't have a monopoly of violence, how do you enforce rule of law? If we say you can't cut down the parks, but the dudes who are cutting down the trees have bigger guns than the police do, then you can cut down the parks, right? Well, how do you have monopoly of violence when individuals or small groups can make catastrophic weapons that can destroy whole cities and whatever? Because exponential tech makes that possible, where I can get access to CRISPR gene drives and people in their basement can make bioweapons, or drones with thermite bombs that are like easy to make, that can take out massive aspects of infrastructure. This problem of, I can do way more damage with an AR-15 than a knife, but I can do way more damage with a CRISPR gene drive than an AR-15. And it was very hard to make nukes. I needed nation state capacity to make nukes, but I don't need nation state capacity to make drone weapons. And so we have an emerging world where decentralized, or cyber weapons that can take out infrastructure. We have a place where decentralized exponential tech makes the world frail in a way that there's no precedent in all of history for. This is why we need history, and we also need imagination, right, and forecasting. And so what do we do about that? What do we do when people can, in their basement, not just be going crazy and getting an AR-15 with a lot of clips, but they can be building CRISPR weapons? China's answer is there is no answer other than ubiquitous surveillance. You need ubiquitous surveillance to be able to suppress a harm that is that great, and the harm of the suppression is less bad than the harm of doing that thing. And that's actually kind of understandable, right? And they're also not in the position of seeing that the US as having been as like innocent and rosy as a lot of people in the US do, because from the outside, the predatory debt lending they've been doing all over the world for the last 20 years, we were doing for a lot longer than that. They just kind of took the World Bank model, copied it, and made it better. The wars that we waged, whatever. So I'm very empathetic to why China is doing what it's doing. And I'm actually very impressed with its ability to build high-speed trains all around the world when we can't fix roads, right? Autocracy with no term limit, so you can do 100-year planning with no internal coordination costs, is an amazing system to build shit. That said, I think if anyone who's concerned about racism in the US doesn't look at the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur and take very seriously what is its actual view towards racial justice, like demonstrably. And if the way we're dealing with it in the US is leading to increasing division of the US, which leads to the rapidity of its breakdown, which is ceding the 21st century to Chinese AI technologically empowered autocracy with that value system, are we just being short-sighted as fuck about actual racism over the next century or any other issue like that? I think Xi also has paid attention to civilizational collapse better because he also has a longer history, right? China has a much longer history. And so he knows that civilizational collapse happens because you get overthrown externally, you have internal dissent, or you run out of resources. So he's worked to have a 100-year resource acquisition plan, which Belt and Road and String of Pearls and whatever are part of. The Sesame credit system and the IoT surveillance system ensures that internal dissent can't happen. And an adequate military ensures that nobody can overthrow them without catastrophic risk to themselves. But any people should think about, how do I prevent our own people from going through civilizational collapse? So like, I'm simultaneously very empathetic with and want answers really better than those answers.
Well, and there's another thing that I think that people in the West fail to understand, is just the reflex for order that goes back to the whole Confucian ideology. And you realize what China has actually endured over the last 150 years, not just the humiliation leading to the Boxer Rebellion, but the Great Leap Forward, which led to 48 million people dying of starvation, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, 35 million people dying in the Civil War and World War II. I mean, it's no wonder that the Chinese citizenry is perfectly happy with the stability that the social credit system is invoking. I mean, the polls say that Chinese people like it because they just want order, predictability.
I wouldn't say I could trust those polls because of the credit system. There's a self-reinforcing dynamic.
Right, of course.
My sense is, from what I have heard of people who have lived and spent a lot of time throughout various regions of China, is that the further you get in actual miles outside of Beijing, the less kind of CCP standard narrative people hold. And it's large enough that, as powerful as the CCP is, it still can't unify 1 point whatever it is, 5-8 billion people. We think the number's probably a lot higher than the reported number, all that well. Like, that's a hard thing to do. And this actually, one of my concerns is, I think the benign China hypothesis of like, no, China's just trying to grow its people, they're not trying to become a world empire, don't worry about it, is completely dreadful. But also, Chinese are the great bad guys is the only thing that could unify all of China against the West. right? Because the people who are there like Louis Vuitton and they like Silicon Valley and they like Hollywood, but they won't if the message they keep hearing is that Americans don't like the Chinese.
No, and I
So
get
I really want to separate the view of the Chinese from a particular regime.
Yeah. Well, and there's a whole issue of face and you know, push comes to shove, the motherland is the motherland, and no, that's fascinating. You should write a book about this. I think.
We've got 23 books, which is impressive, and I have none. So my best chance of any of this being in a book is you and I having conversations.
Well, listen, this has been really wonderful. Both of you guys. I've got to pull off actually for some family stuff on Labor Day weekend, but
Absolutely.
I've really, Satya and Daniel, I really want to keep in touch with you, man. I've really enjoyed both this dialogue and our previous one on the phone. So it's an honor to be with you, man.
Thank you
so much, Wade. Thank you for your time. Thank you for
thank you, everybody.
Just, honoring us with your presence and attention, and thank you for your work.
Great. Thanks, Satya.
Genuinely appreciate it.
Okay, Daniel.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Great. Who put this on? Appreciate it.
I'm going to turn my video on, and can we turn my video on? I would love to thank everyone. Great. Wow. Daniel, Wade, thank you so much. We here at Play Alchemist really believe that was your viewpoints, your messages, the work that you guys have been spending your lifetimes really putting together is just so important to give voice to in this moment. So thank you for giving voice to it. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for being it. Thank you for coming together here in this multiverse of a virtual pyramid of Burning Man. I want to take a moment and thank the entire team that brought this together. I want to thank the builders, the build crew. As you can imagine, the crew that built this pyramid was a little different than the one that built last year's pyramid. I'm just completely amazed with what they were able to create. If you're in the pyramid and you give us some emoji love, that'd be amazing. I want to thank the co-founders of this camp, CK and Crystal. Eugene, Brian, Katie, Keegan, Genevieve, Drew, Yunji. Wow. This has been a week of getting to know you guys, to really kind of be in the trenches with y'all. You reminded me of what Burning Man's all about. Just people coming together, putting aside their differences, and creating something beautiful. Thank you all for that. Thank you all in the audience. You gave us your time and attention. Please look out for an incredible, I don't know what to call it, maybe like a mini doc of this whole experience. It's been amazing. I was extremely skeptical coming into this burn, and this was one of my most profound burns ever, and it was because of all of you that showed up. So thank you all.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you from AltSpace VR. Thank you from this particular burner who